abandoned at the altar. She said yes to a stranger on the street, not knowing he was a mobster. Each like and comment helps heart pulses touch even more hearts. I'll translate the text into English while maintaining the original formatting, tone, and style. Julia ran out of the church as if the world was crumbling around her, the white wedding dress dragging across the ancient stone floor, while tears mixed with the makeup that had taken hours to perfect. The guests were still whispering inside the chapel, their voices echoing like a chorus of judgment she could no longer bear. Her heart beat erratically in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of the moment she discovered the cruelest truth a bride could face. How could I have been so blind? My own sister, she murmured between sobs, the words coming out like sharp blades cutting her own soul. The streets of downtown seemed like a labyrinth with no exit, each corner a reminder of broken promises and shattered dreams that now lay at her feet like shards of glass. Julia walked aimlessly, the heavy dress making each step a torture. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emptiness that had settled in her chest. People passed by her whispering, some taking discreet photos of the abandoned bride, who had become the afternoon spectacle, but she no longer cared about the looks of pity or curiosity. The pride that once defined her was now buried under layers of humiliation and betrayal. 3 years. 3 years of my life thrown away by someone who didn't even have the courage to face me, she thought, feeling the bitter taste of disappointment burning her throat. It was then that she saw him, standing next to a gleaming black car that seemed out of place on that ordinary street, a man who emanated such an intense presence that made Julia stop in the middle of the sidewalk. He was tall, wearing a suit that probably cost more than she earned in months, and there was something in his dark eyes that made her momentarily forget her own pain. James Davis observed the scene with the calm of someone accustomed to evaluating situations before acting, but something about that shattered woman awakened in him a protective instinct he had kept dormant for a long time. Their eyes met across the crowd, and for a moment that seemed eternal, the world around simply ceased to exist. Interesting, he murmured softly, adjusting his shirt cuffs with a gesture that Julia found hypnotizing. Without thinking about what she was doing, Julia walked toward him as if in a trance, each step bringing her closer to that stranger who seemed to have stepped out of a dream or nightmare. Her hands trembled when she extended her arm and grabbed the fine fabric of his suit, feeling the expensive texture under her fingers while looking into his eyes with an intensity that surprised her. James didn't back away, just arched an eyebrow in an expression that mixed curiosity and something deeper she couldn't decipher. His masculine scent invaded her senses, a sophisticated fragrance that spoke of power and mystery, and for a moment Julia felt as if she were about to jump off a precipice. "Marry me," she said, the words leaving her lips before she could think better of it. "Right now, anyone will do." James studied her face with the patience of someone accustomed to making life-changing decisions, his eyes tracing every feature of her tear-stained face as if memorizing a work of art. There was something in Julia's desperate vulnerability that touched a part of him he thought had died long ago, a part that recognized pain and abandonment as old companions. He could see beyond the desperation, could see the strength she tried to hide beneath her apparent fragility, and this intrigued him more than any woman had managed to in years. Without saying a word, James extended his arm in a gesture that was both elegant and possessive, as if sealing an agreement whose terms only he knew. "Are you sure about what you're asking?" he asked with a voice that carried the weight of unspoken warnings. Julia felt a shiver run down her spine when his strong fingers touched her arm, the warm skin contrasting with the cold she had felt inside since the moment of betrayal. There was something dangerously seductive in the way he looked at her, as if he could see through all her defenses and directly touch her wounded soul. She should be afraid, should question the sanity of this moment of madness, but all she could feel was a strange sensation that she had finally found someone who wouldn't judge her for her pain. His arm was solid and secure, an anchor amidst the storm her life had become, and she clung to this feeling like a drowning person clings to a lifeline. "I'm sure I can't feel worse than I already do," she replied, her voice gaining a firmness that surprised her. They walked back to the church together like two actors entering the scene for a play, whose script neither of them had read, but which both seemed willing to perform until the end. Julia felt the curious and scandalized looks from passers-by, but for the first time on that terrible day, she didn't care what they thought of her. There was something liberating about being beside this stranger, as if his presence created a protective bubble around her that kept her safe from judgments and others' pity. James walked with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding any environment he entered, and Julia wondered what kind of life he led to have developed that almost magnetic presence. "Aren't you going to ask my name?" she whispered as they climbed the church steps, her curiosity overcoming her nervousness. James paused for a moment at the chapel entrance, his eyes meeting hers once more with an intensity that made Julia's heart race for completely different reasons than those that had made her run away minutes before. He seemed to be carefully weighing each word before speaking, like a man accustomed to keeping secrets and revealing only what was convenient. There were layers of mystery in his gaze that Julia suspected would take a lifetime to unravel, if that were even possible. The silence stretched between them like an unspoken promise, laden with possibilities and dangers she could barely begin to imagine. "Names can wait," he finally said, his low voice carrying a promise that made her skin tingle. "First, let's take care of what really matters." The priest was still at the altar, nervously organizing his papers and looking at the door as if expecting the runaway groom to appear with a plausible explanation for the abandonment. When he saw Julia returning accompanied by a completely different man, his eyes widened in a mixture of confusion and pastoral concern that almost made her smile for the first time that day. The few guests who had remained in the church whispered among themselves, creating a buzz of speculation that echoed off the ancient walls like a chorus of gossips. Julia felt James lightly squeeze her hand, a subtle gesture of support that made her realize he understood exactly what she was facing. "Father," she said with a firmer voice than she expected, "I'd like to introduce my fiancé, the real one." James greeted the clergyman with the courtesy of someone accustomed to dealing with authorities and delicate situations, but there was a firmness in his manner that made it clear he wasn't there to be questioned or judged. The priest, still stunned by the unusual situation, tried to protest about the irregularity of the procedure, but something in James's look made him reconsider his objections. Julia observed the interaction between the two men, fascinated by how her improvised savior commanded the situation without needing to raise his voice or make threats. There was power in him, a kind of silent and absolute power that spoke of a world she hadn't imagined existed. "I believe all the necessary papers are in order," said James, producing documents that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. "There's no reason to postpone further." The ceremonial words sounded like a distant dream as Julia tried to process the unreality of the situation, her eyes fixed on the aristocratic profile of the man who had become her husband in a matter of minutes. James repeated the vows with a solemnity that seemed natural, as if marrying a stranger in a church was something he did regularly. When it came time to exchange rings, he produced a ring that clearly hadn't been bought that afternoon, a piece that seemed ancient and valuable, loaded with history and meaning. Julia wondered where he had gotten that ring and what story it carried, but the questions dissolved when she felt the cold metal slide onto her finger. "With this ring I thee wed," said James, his words carrying a weight that she suspected went far beyond religious protocol. When it came time for the kiss that would seal the union, Julia felt her heart race like a bird trying to escape a cage, each beat echoing in her ears like war drums. James approached with the same controlled calm he had shown since the moment they met, his hands finding her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity of his gaze. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, they looked into each other's eyes, and Julia had the strange sensation that she was about to cross a line from which she could never return. The kiss was soft, respectful, but loaded with a silent promise that made her skin tingle and her world tilt slightly on its axis. "Now you're mine," he murmured against her lips, the words so quiet that only she could hear. The rice that the few guests threw over them as they left the church seemed to fall in slow motion, each grain a small symbol of the new reality that Julia was embracing without fully understanding its implications. James kept his hand at the small of her back as they walked, a possessive gesture that she should find presumptuous, but instead made her feel strangely protected. The black car waited for them like a carriage from a dark fairy tale, and Julia wondered if she was living a dream or a nightmare, or perhaps something that was a bit of both. When James opened the door for her, their eyes met once more and she saw something in them that made her tremble, not from fear, but from an anticipation she couldn't name. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice carrying much more than curiosity about their physical destination. James slid onto the seat beside her, with the fluid grace of a predator, and Julia noticed how the space inside the car seemed to shrink with his presence, charging with an electric tension that made her skin tingle. He produced a masculine wedding band and placed it on his own finger, with a gesture that seemed loaded with rituals and meanings she did not yet comprehend. The ring was heavy, ornamented with symbols that appeared ancient, and Julia wondered what kind of family or organization would have jewelry with that type of engraving. Their eyes met in the reflection of the window as the car began to move, and she saw in them a depth that promised secrets and dangers that perhaps were better left unknown. "Home," he answered simply, but the word carried implications that made her stomach churn with anxiety and something dangerously close to excitement. When the car finally stopped, Julia looked out the window and felt her breath falter as she saw the imposing mansion that rose before them, all in light stone and glass, surrounded by gardens that seemed to come from an architectural magazine. James got out first and extended his hand to help her, and when their fingers touched, Julia felt an electric current run up her arm and spread throughout her body. He led her up the marble steps with the same controlled elegance as before, but now there was something different in his manner, a deeper intensity that made her feel as if she were being evaluated or tested. At the entrance, he stopped and turned to face her, his eyes tracing her face as if he were memorizing every detail. "Welcome to your new world, Julia," he said, pronouncing her name for the first time with a voice that made something contract in her chest. "I hope you're prepared to discover who I really am." Julia awoke wrapped in silk sheets that cost more than her 6-month salary, the golden morning light filtering through the heavy curtains of a suite that seemed to have stepped out of the pages of a decorating magazine. For a moment of confusion, she wondered where she was, until the reality of the previous day hit her like a cold wave, making her sit up in bed with her heart racing. The wedding dress was carefully hung on a hanger next to a wardrobe that seemed to be the size of her entire former apartment. She touched the ring on her finger, feeling the cold weight of the metal against her skin, as if it were tangible proof that she hadn't dreamed it all. "My God, what have I done?" she murmured to herself, her voice hoarse from crying until she fell asleep. A gentle knock on the door made her jump from the bed, and she quickly put on the silk robe she found at the foot of the bed, tying it at her waist with trembling fingers. When she opened the door, she found a middle-aged woman with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to keep secrets, holding a tray with breakfast that exuded a delicious aroma. The woman entered without asking questions, arranging everything on a table near the window with practical and silent movements, as if it were routine to take care of runaway brides who appeared out of nowhere. Her eyes met Julia's for just a moment, but in that brief contact she felt a careful assessment being made. "The master asked to inform you that he awaits you in the garden when you are ready," said the woman, with a reverence that made Julia feel like an imposter. After a bath that lasted longer than it should have, Julia chose one of the dresses she found in the wardrobe, a simple but elegant piece that fit her body perfectly, as if it had been custom-made. The sensation of silk against her skin made her question again what kind of man kept such expensive women's clothes stored in a guest room, and if she really wanted to discover the answer to that question. Each piece in the closet seemed to tell a story that she preferred not to know, stories of other women who may have passed through that suite before her. The mirror reflected a version of herself that appeared more sophisticated, more mysterious, as if the luxurious environment was transforming her into someone she didn't completely recognize. "Maybe this is exactly what I need," she thought, observing the stranger looking back at her through the glass. James waited for her on the back terrace, sitting at a table set for two with newspapers scattered beside him and a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. He wore a white shirt that highlighted the tan color of his skin and dark pants that seemed to have been cut especially for him, a casual elegance that made Julia feel simultaneously underdressed and overdressed. When she approached, he stood up with the old-fashioned courtesy of a gentleman, pulling out the chair for her to sit, and Julia noticed how his movements were controlled and precise, like those of someone accustomed to command. The silence between them extended for a few moments, filled only by birdsong and the distant sound of running water from a fountain in the gardens. "I hope you slept well," he finally said, his voice polite but maintaining a distance that she couldn't decipher whether it was protection or rejection. Julia accepted the cup of coffee he offered her, noticing how their fingers briefly touched in the transfer, a contact that sent an electric current up her arm and made her question why a simple touch could have such power over her senses. The coffee was perfect, strong in just the right measure, and she wondered if he had somehow discovered her taste or if it was just luck. James read his newspaper with the concentration of someone who needed to always be informed about things that went beyond everyday events, and Julia noticed how his eyes moved quickly across the pages, processing information with the efficiency of someone for whom knowledge was power. There was a tension in his shoulders that she hadn't noticed the day before, a stiffness that suggested concerns that went far beyond having an unexpected wife at home. "Do you always drink coffee while reading about international markets?" she asked, trying to break the ice that seemed to have formed between them during the night. James looked up from the newspaper and studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much of the truth he could share with her, his fingers lightly drumming on the table in a rhythm that betrayed his apparent calm. There were layers in his gaze that she was beginning to recognize, layers of caution and calculation that spoke of a life where every word had weight and every decision had consequences. He carefully folded the newspaper and put it aside, giving her his complete attention in a way that made her feel as if she were being evaluated for a test whose rules she didn't know. Julia realized she was holding her breath, waiting for words that might explain the growing mystery that was James Davis. "Information is power," he replied simply, "and power is the only thing that keeps the people we care about safe." His words carried a weight that made Julia realize she was just beginning to scratch the surface of who the man she had married was, and the idea left her simultaneously fascinated and apprehensive. James rose from the table and walked to the terrace balustrade, his hands resting on the marble as he looked out at the extensive gardens that spread like a green carpet as far as the eye could see. Julia followed him with her eyes, noticing how even relaxed he maintained an alert posture, as if constantly prepared to react to some invisible threat. There was something hypnotic in the way he moved, a controlled grace that spoke of contained strength and power, carefully disguised under a veneer of civility. "You can stay as long as you need," he said without turning around, "until you resolve your situation or decide what you want to do with your life." The apparent generosity of the words failed to mask what Julia interpreted as a polite invitation to leave when she was ready, and something in her chest contracted with a pain she didn't expect to feel. She had spent the last few hours trying to process the madness of what she had done, but somehow the idea of leaving that place, of leaving James, disturbed her more than it should. There was a sense of security in being there that she hadn't experienced for a long time, as if the walls of that mansion could protect her not only from the consequences of her choices, but from a world that suddenly seemed hostile and unpredictable. James still hadn't turned to look at her, but she could feel that he was waiting for her response, measuring her words carefully. "What if I don't know what I want?" she asked, surprised by the vulnerability in her own voice. This question finally made him turn around, and when their eyes met, Julia saw something move in the depths of his gaze, something that seemed dangerously close to tenderness before being quickly masked by his usual controlled expression. James walked back near her, stopping at a distance that was respectful, but charged with a tension that made the air between them vibrate with unspoken possibilities. He extended his hand as if to touch her, but stopped mid-air, his fingers inches from her face, and Julia felt her skin tingle with the proximity of the touch that never came. There was an internal struggle happening behind those dark eyes, a battle between impulse and control that she was beginning to suspect defined much of who he was. "Then you stay until you know," he said simply, but the intensity in his voice transformed the words into something far more significant than a mere offer of hospitality. After breakfast, Julia decided to explore the house she temporarily called home, walking through the wide corridors decorated with artwork that seemed to belong in museums rather than private residences. Each room revealed new details about James's life, clues about a world of wealth and power that she was just beginning to glimpse. In the library, she found books in languages she couldn't identify, first editions that were probably worth fortunes, and old photographs of men with serious looks and impeccable suits. There was something familiar in the faces of those photographs, a resemblance to James that suggested generations of power passing from father to son like a precious and dangerous inheritance. "What kind of family do you have, James?" she murmured to the silent portraits, as if they could reveal secrets that James himself carefully guarded. In his office, which she found by chance when opening a door she thought led to another guest room, Julia discovered an environment that spoke of business, conducted far from the curious eyes of the common world. The desk was imposing, made of dark wood that seemed to have decades of history, and on it were scattered documents in different languages and photographs that she couldn't look at for long without feeling a chill down her spine. There were maps on the walls marked with colored pins, and she wondered what kind of business required this level of organization and secrecy. A shelf full of trophies and recognitions from organizations she had never heard of completed the picture of a man whose interests went far beyond what he showed. Legitimate business, she said to herself, but the doubt in her own voice made her realize that perhaps she didn't want to investigate much deeper. During lunch, served by silent staff who seemed to materialize from nowhere and disappear with the same discretion, Julia noticed how James took calls in different languages, his voice changing in tone and intensity depending on the interlocutor. She pretended to read a magazine while observing his gestures, the way he leaned forward when the conversation became serious, how his eyes hardened when someone on the other end of the line apparently displeased him. There was a ballet of power happening right in front of her, and Julia felt like a privileged audience to a spectacle whose rules she didn't fully comprehend. When he finally hung up the phone and turned to her, Julia saw that he had noticed her attentive observation. "Curiosity killed the cat," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, but there was a gentle warning in his words that made her blush. In the afternoon, Julia found a favorite spot in the solarium, surrounded by tropical plants and natural light that created an almost magical environment where she could think without feeling observed. But even there, she occasionally caught glimpses of men walking through the gardens, always in pairs, always alert, and began to understand that James's security went far beyond a common alarm system. They moved with the discipline of trained professionals, and Julia wondered what kind of threats a man like James faced to need so much protection. The realization made her question her own safety, whether by associating with him she was putting herself in danger or finding the protection she never knew she needed. Perhaps some questions are better left unanswered, she thought, but her curious nature made it impossible to stop observing and questioning. When night fell, Julia positioned herself at the window of her room, observing the gardens bathed in moonlight and wondering how her life had taken such an unexpected turn in just 24 hours. It was then that she saw James walking along the stone paths, phone glued to his ear, gesturing with more intensity than she had seen during the day. Even from a distance, she could sense the tension in his movements, the way he stopped and resumed walking when something in the conversation disturbed him. There was an urgency in his gestures that contrasted with the controlled calm he maintained during the day, as if darkness revealed aspects of his personality that sunlight helped to hide. Julia found herself hypnotized by that rawer version of him, more real and dangerous. "Who are you really, James Davis?" she whispered to the window glass, knowing that perhaps she wasn't prepared for the answer. She was so absorbed watching him that she didn't notice when he stopped walking and turned his face toward her window, as if he had felt her gaze across the distance and darkness. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they looked at each other across the gardens, two strangers united by an impossible marriage and separated by secrets that neither was ready to share. James said something quickly into the phone and hung up, but continued looking in her direction, and Julia felt her heart race as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. There was something primitive and magnetic about that distant gaze, a connection that defied logic and the prudence she was trying to maintain. "He knows I'm here," she realized, and something in her stomach tightened with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Julia moved quickly away from the window, her heart beating as if she had run a marathon, but she couldn't resist the impulse to look once more. James was no longer in the gardens, and she wondered if she had imagined that entire moment of silent connection, or if he really had the power to appear and disappear like a shadow. The room suddenly seemed too small, charged with a tension she couldn't name, and Julia began to pace back and forth trying to calm her electrified nerves. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the footsteps in the corridor, didn't notice the silent approach until a familiar voice cut through the silence. "Can't sleep." Julia turned so quickly she almost lost her balance, and there was James, leaning against the doorframe she was sure she had locked, watching her with those eyes that seemed to see much more than she was comfortable revealing. He had exchanged his suit for more casual clothes, but still maintained that magnetic presence that made the air around him vibrate with an almost palpable energy. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it during the phone conversation she had observed, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her realize he was as affected by that moment in the garden as she was. "I was just admiring the view," she said, hating how weak and unconvincing her voice sounded. She turned and found him standing there, watching, as if he knew every thought she had. The emerald dress that James had chosen for her fit Julia's body like a second skin, every curve enhanced by the silky fabric that cost more than she earned in an entire year. When she descended the mansion's stairs, she found him waiting in the main hall, devastatingly elegant in a tuxedo that seemed to have been sewn directly onto his body, and for a moment she forgot to breathe, seeing the way he observed her from bottom to top. There was something predatory in the way his eyes traveled over every inch of her, a masculine appreciation that made her skin tingle under the intense gaze. James offered his arm with his usual courtesy, but when she touched him, Julia felt the tension in his muscles as if he were fighting against some primitive impulse. "You look beautiful," he said, but there was something in his voice that transformed the compliment into something much more intimate and dangerous. The hotel where the charity event took place was a monument to luxury and ostentation, with crystal chandeliers that cost fortunes and decor that screamed old money and consolidated power. Julia felt like an imposter, walking through halls filled with people who were born into that world of privilege, their jewels shining under the lights as they discussed business deals moving millions as if they were pennies. James guided her through social groups with the confidence of someone who had always belonged to that universe, introducing her as his wife to people whose names she recognized from financial newspapers. Each handshake, each polite smile made her feel she was playing a role for which she hadn't memorized the script. "They all seem to know you very well," she whispered as they walked between the tables, "but I feel like I don't know you at all." James stopped walking for a moment, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made the buzz of the party around them completely disappear, as if they were alone in a bubble of tension and unspoken meaning. There were layers of secrets in that look, promises and warnings mixed in a way that left her simultaneously excited and apprehensive about what she might discover. He raised his hand as if to touch her face, but held back at the last moment, his fingers hovering in the air between them like a caress that never materialized. The orchestra's music continued in the background, but all Julia could hear were the quickened beats of her own heart echoing in her ears. "Perhaps it's better this way," he finally responded, but his voice carried a melancholy that made her question whether he truly believed those words. It was during dinner that Julia saw him, walking between the tables with the casual confidence of someone who felt at home in any social environment, his eyes scanning the hall until they found her sitting next to James. Michael had been her most persistent suitor before she met her ex-fiancé, a charming and successful man who had never fully accepted her rejection. When their gazes met across the crowded hall, Julia felt her stomach tighten with a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension, remembering all the times he had tried to convince her that they deserved a chance together. James must have noticed the change in her posture, because she felt him lean slightly toward her, his presence becoming more protective and alert. "Someone you know?" he asked, with a casualness that didn't completely mask the tension in his voice. Before Julia could respond, Michael was approaching their table, navigating through the crowd with the charming smile she remembered so well, the one that could disarm any female resistance without much effort. He greeted James with the polite courtesy of two men who recognized each other as social equals, but there was an underlying tension in the air that made Julia realize that both were carefully measuring each other. When Michael kissed her hand in an old-fashioned but charming gesture, Julia noticed how James stiffened beside her, his fingers closing slightly around the wine glass he was holding. The conversation that followed was civilized on the surface, but loaded with subtexts and veiled provocations that only men fully understood. "Julia has always had impeccable taste," said Michael, but there was something in his tone that transformed the compliment into a subtle challenge. When James stepped away to take an urgent call, leaving Julia alone with Michael for a few minutes, she immediately realized that this had been the moment he was waiting for since he saw her in the hall. Michael leaned toward her, lowering his voice to an intimacy that reminded her of all the conversations they had shared in the past, all the times he had tried to win her heart with sweet words and romantic promises. There was an urgency in his movements that suggested he had come to the event specifically to find her, and Julia wondered how he had discovered she would be there. His eyes scanned her face with the familiarity of someone who had spent months trying to decipher every expression, every mood change. "So you can't be serious about this marriage," he said, his voice laden with concern that seemed genuine. "You don't even know this man, Julia." Michael's words found exactly the vulnerable point that Julia had been trying to ignore since she woke up that morning in James's mansion, the voice of reason whispering that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. He continued speaking, his words carefully chosen to awaken all the doubts she was trying to suppress, each phrase making her question her choices and the sanity of having married a complete stranger. There was a sincerity in his concern that touched her, reminding her of what it was like to be cared for by someone who really knew her, someone who understood her insecurities and fears without needing explanations. Michael took her hand between his, the touch familiar and comfortable, in contrast to the dangerous electricity she always felt when James touched her. "I've discovered some things about him, Julia," he whispered, his serious eyes fixed on hers. "Things you need to know before it's too late." Julia felt a chill run down her spine when Michael started to insinuate things about James that she had suspected but tried to ignore, words that painted a picture of a man involved in businesses that went far beyond what appeared to be legitimate. Each revelation was like a puzzle piece fitting into place, forming an image that explained the excessive security, the mysterious phone calls, the power he wielded without explanations. Michael spoke with the passion of someone who truly cared about her well-being, his hands squeezing hers with an urgency that made her realize he was genuinely scared for her. There were unshed tears in his eyes when he begged her to leave James before it was too late, before she became involved in a world from which she might not be able to escape. "Come with me now," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "We can still fix this, Julia. We can still have the life we should have had together." It was at that moment that Julia felt a presence behind her, a change in the temperature of the air that made her know, without having to look, that James had returned and heard at least part of the conversation. When she turned, she found him standing a few feet away, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something beyond careful control in his eyes. There was fire there, a primitive intensity that completely transformed his aristocratic features into something more dangerous and wild. Michael must have noticed the change too, because he released her hands and straightened in his chair, but he didn't back down, standing firm as if he was prepared to fight for what he believed was right. The silence that settled between the three was charged with a tension that made Julia realize she was at the center of a dispute that went far beyond simple male jealousy. "I believe my wife and I have other commitments," said James, his voice dangerously calm, but there was a veiled threat in the words that made Michael pale slightly. James offered his arm to Julia with a gesture that seemed courteous but that she recognized as a territorial claim, a silent declaration of possession that made something in her belly contract with a mixture of irritation and inexplicable excitement. She accepted his arm because she couldn't think of an alternative that wouldn't cause a public scene, but mainly because there was something in the intensity of his gaze that completely hypnotized her. Michael tried to protest, following them a few steps while whispering urgencies about how she was making a terrible mistake, but James simply continued walking, guiding her through the crowd with the determination of a man on a mission. Julia could feel the tension radiating from his body, every muscle prepared for action, and for the first time she had a glimpse of the dangerous man hiding behind the civilized facade. "You heard our entire conversation." It wasn't a question, but a statement she made as they walked toward the doors leading to the terrace. The hotel terrace offered a spectacular view of the city, the lights stretching like fallen stars to the horizon. But Julia barely noticed the beauty around her because all her attention was focused on the man who had brought her there. James released her arm and walked to the balustrade, his hands resting on the cold marble. As he looked at the city below, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the internal struggle happening behind the controlled silence. When he finally turned to face her, Julia saw that the fire in his eyes had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified, transforming into something that made her breath falter. There was possessiveness in that look, but also vulnerability, as if for the first time he was showing something real of himself. "He's right, you know," said James, his voice hoarse. "You should leave me. I am exactly the type of man your mother warned you to avoid." His words should have been a relief, a confirmation that she should accept Michael's offer and return to the safety of a predictable and normal life. But instead, Julia found herself walking toward him, drawn to the raw honesty in his confession, to the way he was looking at her, as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered at that moment. There was something magnetic about his vulnerability, about the way he was fighting against himself, to do the right thing even when it was obvious that he wanted to do exactly the opposite. When she stopped a few inches from him, Julia could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear his slightly accelerated breathing mixing with her own. "What if I don't want to leave?" she asked, surprised by the courage in her own voice. "What if I want to stay exactly where I am?" Her question broke the last barrier of control that James had maintained since the moment he met her. And Julia saw the exact moment when he stopped fighting against what he felt and surrendered to the inevitable. He stepped toward her, completely eliminating the distance between them, his hands finding her face with a delicacy that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. Julia felt her breath falter when he tilted his head, his lips inches from hers, and for a moment that seemed suspended in time, they looked into each other's eyes as if they were sealing an agreement whose terms neither fully understood. The kiss, when it finally happened, was everything she had imagined and more intense and desperate, as if they were two castaways clinging to each other amid a storm. He pulled away first, but left on her lips the promise of everything he didn't say. Julia woke the next morning with the taste of the kiss still burning on her lips, the memory of the intensity of that moment on the terrace making her heart race even before fully opening her eyes. She had dreamed of James's hands on her face, of the way he had looked at her as if she were the only thing that mattered in the world, and for a few precious seconds, she could still feel the echo of that visceral connection that had consumed them. But when she went down for breakfast, she found only an empty table and a polite note explaining that he had left early to resolve urgent business. The disappointment she felt was disproportionate for someone she had known for just a few days, but there was something about his absence that made her realize how much she had already grown accustomed to his presence. "Perhaps it's better this way," she whispered to herself, but even she didn't believe those words. The first day without James passed like an eternity, each hour dragging as Julia tried to occupy her mind with books from the immense library, walks through the gardens that now seemed empty without the possibility of encountering him, and polite conversations with the staff who had clearly received instructions to treat her with courtesy but maintain distance. She caught herself several times looking through the window of his office, hoping to see the black car coming up the circular driveway, imagining what his expression would be when he saw her, if there would be embarrassment or if he would act as if nothing had happened. The house seemed larger in his absence, each room echoing with the silence of unanswered questions and unexplored feelings. When night came and he still hadn't returned, Julia felt a loneliness she hadn't experienced since the first days after her ex-fiancé's betrayal. "He's hiding from me," she realized, and this realization hurt more than it should. The second day brought the same routine of absence and waiting, but now Julia began to feel a growing irritation mixed with hurt, an indignation that came from the wounded pride of a woman who was clearly being avoided after having shared a moment of genuine intimacy. She tried to convince herself that she was being dramatic, that James probably had legitimate reasons for his absence, but the rational part of her mind fought against the emotional voice whispering that he was regretting what had happened between them. During lunch, she finally asked the woman who served her meals when he would return, but received only a compassionate look and a vague answer about important business that could last several days. The compassion in the employee's eyes was almost worse than the uncertainty, because it suggested that everyone in the house knew exactly what was happening. Even the servants pity me, she thought, feeling her cheeks burn with humiliation. On the third day, Julia woke with a fierce determination burning in her chest, a decision that she would no longer wait for a man who clearly considered her a mistake to be avoided, no matter how intense the moment they shared had been. She put on one of the most elegant dresses from the wardrobe, arranged her hair with the care of a woman preparing for battle, and positioned herself in the main living room with a book in her hands, pretending to read while waiting. There was something pathetic about planning a casual encounter in her own temporary home, but Julia was beyond the point of worrying about pride when it came to getting the answers she deserved. Every sound in the house made her look up hopefully. Every car that passed on the street made her think that finally he had decided to face the situation like an adult. "If he thinks he can ignore me until I disappear, he's very mistaken," she muttered, gripping the book hard enough to leave finger marks on the cover. When James finally walked through the living room doors in the middle of the afternoon, Julia felt her heart skip a beat before settling into an accelerated rhythm that deeply irritated her, because it meant she still reacted to his presence with the intensity of a lovesick teenager. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept properly in days, but still maintained that natural elegance that had attracted her from the first moment, wearing a dark suit that enhanced the tanned color of his skin and those eyes she knew were capable of such fire. When their gazes met, Julia saw something move in the depths of those eyes before being quickly replaced by the mask of cold courtesy that she was beginning to hate. There was tension in his shoulders, a stiffness suggesting that this encounter was as difficult for him as it was for her, but that didn't diminish the anger growing in her chest. "I thought you had died," she said, her voice loaded with sarcasm that failed to hide the hurt behind the words. James stopped in the middle of the room, maintaining a careful distance between them that spoke louder than any word could. And Julia realized he had calculated exactly where to stand to avoid any possibility of accidental touch or proximity that might recreate the intimacy they had shared. There was something almost cruel in the way he studied her, as if he were evaluating a business situation instead of looking at the woman he had kissed desperately just 3 nights before. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the professional coldness she had heard only once before, the day they met, and the difference between that man and the one who had kissed her on the terrace was so striking that it made her question whether she had imagined all the passion. The silence stretched between them like a growing abyss, filled only by the sound of her own heart beating too hard. "I had to resolve some urgent matters," he said finally, but there was something in his eyes that transformed the reasonable excuse into an obvious lie. Julia rose from the armchair with controlled movements, every gesture calculated to show that she wasn't broken or desperate, even though inside she felt exactly that way, as if someone had trampled her heart and then pretended nothing had happened. She walked until she was a few meters from him, close enough to see the small lines of tension around his eyes, far enough to keep her dignity intact should he back away even further. There was a silent battle happening in the air between them, a war of wills where neither wanted to be the first to admit that what had happened on the terrace had meant something more than a moment of temporary madness. James kept his hands firmly behind his back, as if he didn't trust himself to keep them away from her, and this small revelation gave Julia the courage she needed to finally confront him. 3 days, she said, allowing all her hurt to leak into her voice. 3 days you avoided me as if I were a contagious disease. The accusation hit James exactly where Julia intended, and she saw his defenses falter for a moment before regaining strength with renewed force. But in that brief instant of vulnerability, she caught a glimpse of the internal struggle he was waging. There was pain in those eyes, an anguish that mirrored hers, and for a moment Julia thought she would finally break through the barriers he had erected between them since that kiss. But then James straightened his shoulders and assumed the posture she was learning to recognize as his emotional armor, the mask of the powerful man who couldn't afford inconvenient feelings. When he spoke, his voice had the cutting quality of a sharp blade to sever any emotional connection that might still exist between them. "So it was a mistake," he said, and each word fell between them like stones thrown into a lake, creating waves of pain that spread to the deepest corners of her heart. "You don't belong in this world, Julia. And I shouldn't have forgotten that, not even for a second." James's words hit Julia like physical slaps, each syllable meant to push her away and protect her from a danger he seemed to know better than she did, but which to her perception sounded like pure and simple rejection. There was a finality in his voice that left no room for arguments or negotiations, a decision already made that she hadn't been consulted about, and this realization ignited an anger she didn't know she was capable of feeling. Julia raised her chin with the fierce pride of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life, but who had always found strength in adversity, and when she spoke, her voice trembled not with tears, but with pure indignation. "How convenient," she said, each word dripping with sarcasm, "to decide this for me as if I were a child incapable of making my own choices about the risks I want to take." There was fire in her eyes now, a determination that James recognized as dangerous to his own defenses. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I really don't belong in a world where people run away from their own feelings." James took a step back as if she had physically struck him, and Julia saw that her words had found their target, but the satisfaction of victory was quickly replaced by the pain of seeing the distance grow even greater between them. There was a struggle happening behind those dark eyes, a battle between what he wanted to do and what he believed was right. But Julia was too tired and too hurt to try to decipher the motives of a man who chose emotional cowardice instead of honesty. She turned to leave the room, each step an act of willpower, but stopped at the door when she heard his voice behind her, softer now, laden with something that might have been regret if she still had hopes that he would change his mind. "Julia," he said, and her name on his lips still had the power to make her heart race. "I'll arrange the divorce papers. You'll be fine financially. I'll make sure of that." The offer of money was the last humiliation she could bear. "Keep your dirty money," she replied without turning. "That's not what I want from you." Climbing the stairs to her room was one of the hardest things Julia had ever done, each step a small victory of dignity over the impulse to run back and beg him to explain why he was throwing away something that had been so intense and true. Her hands were shaking when she began to pack her few possessions, the expensive clothes he had provided being carefully folded and left in the wardrobe, because taking anything that came from him would be accepting the financial handout she had rejected. The wedding dress still hanging in the closet made her pause for a moment, remembering the day it all began, when an elegant stranger had been her salvation from public humiliation. Now it seemed ironic that the same man had become the source of pain even deeper than the original betrayal. How was I so stupid to think this could work? She asked the reflection in the mirror, but the woman looking back seemed stronger than she felt, more determined to survive yet another romantic disappointment. The call for a taxi was made with fingers that trembled only slightly, and Julia felt proud of keeping her voice steady when she gave the address of a friend who had always said her door would be open in case of emergency. Carrying her single small suitcase down the stairs was a symbolic act of independence, a declaration that she needed no one's help to rebuild her life once again. When she reached the main hall, James was nowhere to be seen, and Julia tried to convince herself this was a relief instead of a final disappointment. The staff member who always served her meals appeared as if she had been waiting, with eyes full of compassion that made Julia realize everyone in the house had witnessed her silent humiliation. "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" the woman asked gently, but Julia just smiled with a courage she didn't entirely feel. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The car arrived faster than she expected, and Julia found herself wishing for a few more minutes to absorb the grandeur of the house that had been her home for such a short time, to memorize the details of a place where she had experienced passion and pain in equal measures. When the driver took her suitcase, she looked one last time at the elegant stairs, half expecting James to appear to stop her from leaving, to finally admit he was making a mistake letting her go. But the minutes passed and he didn't appear, and Julia realized the fairy tale had come to an end in the most realistic way possible, with the princess saving herself instead of waiting for a prince who had decided she wasn't worth the risk. "Where to, Mom?" asked the driver, and his gentle voice almost broke the carefully maintained composure that Julia had built for this moment. "Away from here," she answered, "as far away as possible." As the car descended the circular driveway of the mansion, Julia couldn't resist the urge to look back one last time, and that's when she saw him in the office window, a solitary figure watching her departure with an intensity that made her question again if she was doing the right thing. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were hunched as if carrying an invisible weight, and for one crazy moment, she considered asking the driver to stop the car. But then she remembered his cold words, the way he had reduced the most intense moment of her life to a simple error in judgment, and found the strength to turn forward and not look back again. James had made his choice when he decided that protecting her was more important than loving her, and now she would make hers. She closed the car door, and he didn't come down the stairs to stop her. But he remained at the window until he could no longer see anything. Julia had spent an entire week trying to convince herself that she was rebuilding her life, living in a small apartment belonging to a friend and seeking employment with the fierce determination of someone who needed to prove to herself that she could survive without the protection of a mysterious man. But when the phone rang on that rainy Tuesday night, and an unknown voice on the other end whispered threats about her interesting marriage and how certain people would be very interested in getting to know her better, Julia felt her blood freeze in her veins. The words were carefully chosen, but there was something disturbing about the call that left her uncomfortable, and suddenly the protected world she had left behind seemed much safer than the harsh reality she now faced. "You should have stayed where you were safe," said the voice before hanging up, leaving Julia trembling alone in the dark apartment. Without thinking twice, she dialed the number she had memorized but sworn never to use, her fingers trembling as she waited for him to answer, each ring of the phone seeming like an eternity, until she finally heard that familiar, deep voice that still had the power to make her heart race. "Julia," James said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he had been waiting for this call, as if he knew that sooner or later she would need him again. When she managed to explain about the anonymous call, feeling her voice tremble with fear and wounded pride at having to admit she needed help, the silence on the other end of the line was more eloquent than any word. "Stay where you are," he finally said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, and Julia, don't open the door to anyone else." When James appeared at the door of the modest apartment, he wasn't alone, and for the first time Julia saw the true power he wielded without needing explanations or justifications. There were discreet men strategically positioned on the street, cars that clearly didn't belong in that neighborhood, and a security operation that transformed the quiet street into an invisible but impenetrable fortress. James entered the apartment like a force of nature, his eyes scanning every corner with the efficiency of someone trained to assess threats, and when he finally turned to her, Julia saw that the controlled man who had tried to protect her by keeping his distance had been replaced by someone much more dangerous and protective. "Pack your things," he said with an authority that admitted no discussion. "You will not spend another night here." The journey back to the mansion was made in tense silence, Julia watching through the window of the armored car as the city passed in a haze of lights and rain, while processing the realization that just a week ago she had chosen to leave that protection out of wounded pride. James sat beside her, radiating a controlled tension she could feel without having to look at him. His hands crossed in his lap in a way that suggested he was fighting the urge to touch her and reassure her. When they finally arrived at the mansion, he guided her not to the guest room where she had stayed before, but to his own bedroom, and Julia realized something fundamental had changed in the dynamics between them. "You will stay here," he said, "where I can be sure you are safe regardless of what you decide about us." In his bedroom, surrounded by personal belongings that revealed layers of his personality she had never seen before, Julia finally understood that James was ready to show who he really was, without masks or protections. He sat on the edge of the bed and began to unbutton his shirt slowly, not in a seductive manner, but with the solemnity of someone revealing secrets they had kept their entire life. The marks on his chest and arms told stories of a challenging life, each representing obstacles overcome, that she was being invited to read. There were tattoos that she recognized as symbols of power and loyalty, marks from a world that operated by different rules than those she knew. "This is my world, Julia," he finally said, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely showed. "A world where people like you become targets simply for being close to people like me." Julia approached him slowly, her hands trembling not from fear but from emotion, because he finally trusted her enough to show his complete truth. She touched one of the most visible scars with the delicacy of someone touching something sacred, feeling under her fingers the physical proof of a life lived on the edge between power and danger. When their eyes met, Julia saw that he was waiting for her to back away, expecting that the reality of who he was would make her run away once more. Instead, she leaned in and softly kissed the scar beneath her fingers, a gesture that said everything words could never express about accepting not just the man, but also the world that had shaped him. "I'm not running away this time," she whispered against his skin. "Not from you, not from what we are together." Her words broke the last barrier that James had maintained between them, and when he pulled her into his arms, it was with the urgency of a man who had spent too long fighting against what he knew was inevitable from the moment he met her. The kiss was different from the previous ones, deeper and loaded with promises and mutual acceptance, as if they were finally admitting that they belonged to each other regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. Julia felt herself melting against him, all the hurt and doubts of the past week dissolving into the certainty that this was her place, in his arms, in his dangerous but honest world. When they separated, both breathing heavily, she saw in his eyes a peace that hadn't been there before. "It won't be easy," he said, caressing her face with a tenderness that contrasted with the scars on his hands. "My world doesn't forgive weaknesses, and you have become my greatest weakness." Julia smiled for the first time in a week, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face and made James realize he had made the right decision by bringing her back home. "Then you better teach me to be strong enough to survive in it," she replied, and there was a determination in her voice that made him realize the woman in his arms was much more resilient than either of them had imagined. She had chosen to stay not out of desperation or lack of options, but because she had finally found where she belonged, and that conscious choice made all the difference in the world for both of them. James intertwined his fingers with hers, a simple gesture that sealed an agreement much more significant than any marriage contract. He intertwined his fingers with hers, like someone who knows that some bonds are stronger than any word. Did you like Julia and James's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.